I call it the mind rape of the children, to tell them that they are neither male nor female, or tell them things that make them hate their body or suggest that they should reject their bodies. It's like a war on our families, on our friendships, through this weaponization of loneliness, through this fear of being cast out and demonized if you don't get with these insane programs and agendas.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us today. We have an important conversation with author Stella Morabito about her book, The Weaponization of Loneliness, about the way people are being isolated, silenced, divided, and conquered by coercive forces. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Americans are more isolated than ever. The forces that once knit individuals to their communities have been breaking down in recent decades to the point where they are almost disappearing. Many, if not most of us, live apart from our extended families, are not active members of faith communities, and are unlikely to be part of clubs, groups, or organizations dedicated to social activity or causes. It has been long apparent that we are, in the words of sociologist Robert Putnam, bowling alone. But as divorce increases, marriage decreases, and with the rise of social media and remote work, these factors have heightened our sense of isolation to an alarming degree. And then came COVID, when we were all put into virtual solitary confinement, vulnerable to having our fears stoked and manipulated with misinformation, and ready to be part of mobs targeting whoever it was that were in the crosshairs of those supplying the information, whether it was opponents of lockdowns, mask mandates, or those who questioned the value of vaccines, which, while helpful, did not deliver on the promise of providing immunity. Most of us intuitively understood that this is connected to an increase in mental health issues. But what many of us were reluctant to understand was how this fed into our political divisions. It is this isolation, aided by the way our news media have been enlisted in left-wing causes, that has helped to distort our political debates, as well as the way we think about issues like race and gender. By undermining faith, by closing churches and synagogues, while keeping open big box stores and liquor outlets, our society continued its decline with predictable results. For individuals, identity politics and cancel culture were enabled by the same forces, tearing down our bonds with each other and our faith to our history and the values of Western civilization. With our institutions thoroughly infiltrated by ideologues and left alone, addicted to screens and social media sites, our resistance to totalitarian impulses has been reduced. Whether it was COVID, or Black Lives Matter, or the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Americans have been bullied into submission, worried with good reason that any resistance to these forces will leave us completely cut off from society as well as livelihoods and communities. The implications of this for our political future, as well as the health of our society, are incalculable. Getting to the heart of this issue is something few people have attempted to do, let alone drawing the correct conclusions about it. But one person who has done so is author Stella Morabito, and we're very pleased to have her with us today. Stella Morabito is a senior contributor to The Federalist, where she writes about the social fallout of propaganda, mob psychology, and the cult mindset. She's also been published at the Washington Examiner, American Greatness, Town Hall, and elsewhere. She began her professional life as an analyst at the CIA, where she focused on methods of communist media and propaganda and disinformation. And she is the author of the important new book, The Weaponization of Loneliness: How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer. Stella Morabito, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. I think you've written a very important book. There's so much I want to get into, but let me start by asking you, what drove you to write it at this specific time? Now, much of what you go into in your book about how dictatorial regimes and ideas sort of influence and isolate people is timeless, but it's particularly relevant to us today, right now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely it is. Well, I think the book has been in me for a very long time, although not necessarily consciously earlier on in my life. But at this time, at this stage of our history, I thought it was extremely important that Americans, well, everybody really, become more aware of the dynamics that cause us to shut up about what we believe or even lie about what we believe just so that maybe we fit in. It's kind of that herd instinct. Now, we all know about the herd instinct, but I think that to a large extent, we're in denial about it. And I just felt it was extremely important to map it all out, take all the literature that I had read about these phenomena, and put it all in one place, whether it's Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. There's a long list. Robert Nisbet's book about the quest for community. All of these books focus on, or at least mention, the importance for tyranny to isolate people in order to control them. And I could just see this happening everywhere. And I just felt extremely important to make Americans more aware of these dynamics and how they work on us, how they work within us, and how they affect public opinion. I mean, when we shut up about what we believe, we're actually affecting public opinion, or what ends up being polling or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think the thing that struck me is that there are elements of this that I think most people already recognized. I mean, Robert Putnam wrote a book 20 years ago about people bowling alone, about the sort of the way American society had changed. People were no longer, organizing in groups, no longer, connecting with faith communities, with their families. They were isolated, but they were disconnecting this from politics. And, the rise, obviously, since he wrote that book, the rise of social media, the internet, have made those factors, I think, incomparably, greater and stronger and more dangerous. And then, with big tech, and we've seen how that manipulates us. But then, of course, with COVID, it's really connected to our politics in a way that I think perhaps sociologists and people who were thinking about isolation were ignoring for a long time.
Oh, that's right. It's interesting you mentioned Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, because 50 years before he wrote that, Robert Nisbet wrote the book I just mentioned, The Quest for Community, that really delves into how the totalitarian mind tries to separate us and isolate us from our relationships, from those mediating institutions of society that, those are the buffer zones between the isolated individual and the mass state. The three main ones are family, faith, and then community. And, friendships and all manner of associations blossom out from that. And those associations and the inability to control them has always been a thorn in the side of tyrants. But, it's interesting also because when you talk about alienation and this sense of kind of atomization of human beings, it's actually been going on for a long time. I mean, a French sociologist by the name of Emile Durkheim wrote a book that focused on the Industrial Revolution. This was 19th century. He wrote this about how the Industrial Revolution caused this sense of, he called it anomie, the sense of feeling alone in a crowd, or maybe more alone than you would feel by yourself when you're around a lot of people, but you can't talk to them, or you feel alienated. So this has been going on for a long time, but the technological revolution has really exponentially increased. I mean, even since Putnam wrote that book, this sense of disconnectedness, or not really living in real life, but more virtual life, and especially for youth. So, it's been going on for a long time. And of course, it feels like we're reaching a tipping point now.
Yeah. And I think, sort of the institutions, which you briefly mentioned, the institutions that sort of acted as a buffer that sort of reinforced our sense of connected to us, they've collapsed in our country, or at least, if in large measures, Americans are less religious, communal organizations are less, influential. We don't affiliate in the way, we don't belong to clubs. We don't live near our families anymore, at least many, if not most of us. And that has contributed to this too, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, this has been going on, like I said, for a long time. And the family in particular, the family brokenness that I believe has been made a lot worse by government policies that reward fatherlessness, that reward, the reliance and dependency on the government, that reward, there's a long list of cultural issues that our government seems to be very invested in. I mean, abortion up to infanticide. I mean, all of these things break down human bonds. They have a very negative effect on our sense of connection with one another. And of course, as you said, when fewer people belong to religious organizations, especially traditional religion, and of course, community interactions, it's become there's a lot of breakdown. However, these mediating institutions of family, faith, community are still the most decentralized of all the institutions that we're seeing. I mean, if you look at all the other institutions that have been corrupted, subverted, I mean, not just, legislatures and courts, but and academia, of course, but now K-12 education, you go on through the list, the arts, of course, media, big tech, and now military as well, the military. So it's kind of like all these other institutions that have fallen away from their original mission have been subverted. But the big prize of totalitarians has always been those mediating institutions. The other institutions are kind of like gateways to our personal relationships, our associations. And as Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the first order of any tyrannical government is to bring about isolation so that people can be more easily controlled. And, if they're going to be influenced by members of their family or faith or community members, friendships, then the state cannot have quite the grasp on people as it would otherwise, where terror is a lot easier to use to enforce compliance when people don't have those connections, those social connections to fall back on. So we see, and well, I could go off on one other direction here, but we can
feel free.
Well, we can see, and I'm currently in the process of writing up more than one article about the recent release by the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. Earlier this month, or earlier in May, he released what's called an advisory, a government advisory from the Surgeon General, entitled "Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Social Isolation." And I read through it, and I found it actually very chilling. It's got all kinds of hearts and flowers, like, oh, reach out to your loved ones, and all of that sprinkled throughout. But there's a lot in there that looks like a direct government, like a blueprint for invading the private sphere of life, because it calls for an infrastructure to bring about social connection in every organization, institution, in every locality. And this is a federal document, advisory, which means it's urgent matter that needs action. And so I find it something that we really need to be made a whole lot more aware of. And I think, it came out and, there were a lot of glowing reports about it, from NPR and the usual news outlets, and even Lancet and medical journals. But there isn't enough, and this is where I'm writing about it. There isn't enough attention. I mean, to how it wants policy to be driven everywhere, having to do with this social connection and how to bring about more social connection. But DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is a big part of that. And it calls for the whole medical sector to be brought into this and to monitor connection and social connection, for technologies to do this. So anyway, I only mention that as a sidelight because the road that we've been going down, where our government has actually enforced isolation on us, most obviously during their COVID era, they're not going to let up on this. And this Surgeon General in particular has been, a big fan of censorship, which of course divides people, prevents us from talking to one another. He called for the canceling of doctors who had a different idea about COVID treatment, having them taken down from social media. So this isn't going to go away. And I see this advisory as a blueprint, really, for more invasion of that private sphere of life and control. So thank you for letting me summarize.
No, I think it's important. And I want to get into the whole woke catechism of DEI and the way it has, sort of taken over government and business, but a little later. But let me ask you a question first that goes, I think, to sort of how people can recognize what's going on. Now, especially in your book, you talked about the way sort of groupthink worked in the past, the French Revolution, Russia, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, all of these instances in history where sort of the contemporary American will look at it and say, well, of course, there was a revolution. There was, everything was overturned. It was obvious that someone was trying to manipulate people. But they still think, they think of themselves as, and to some extent, they're living in a democracy. They think they have free choice. They think that if there are ideas being promulgated, they are good ideas about making us nicer. I mean, even Joe Biden referred to sort of the whole DEI thing as just a way of making people more sensitive. And, leaving aside, his lack of comprehension for some of the things that the left has foisted on him. That is how a lot of people think about the situation today. They, as much as, when, again, we can get into COVID specifically in a subsequent question, but they don't think they're living in a time of revolution. They think they're living in a time of normalcy where life goes on. And what happened in COVID was just an aberration, just sort of, somebody got sick. Okay, we listen to the doctor. They tell us what to do. They don't think they're in that situation where, they're the object of, the origins of totalitarianism.
Right. No, there's been a whole lot of complacency, which is kind of like a default reaction to a lot of cases of danger, really. It's just, oh no, it's nothing. It'll go away. And hey, I can go outside. I can go to the store. Everything is just fine. So I think it's going to, what we're going to need really to get through this is a strong and loud and courageous minority that can help people see through a lot of stuff, that creates more of a ripple effect. And that's something that I discuss in the book as well. Looking at the conformity, experiments that Solomon Asch conducted. So much of the research that I delved into came from mid-20th century America. It's really amazing. That's just kind of a sidelight, but Marshall McLuhan, Solomon Asch, Robert Nisbet, all of these really great, incisive insights came from that era. We don't see a lot of that, and I think a lot of that lack is due to what I call the cultivation of ignorance in education, in academia and education, where we don't really ask questions, certainly not on college campuses like we used to. And, that's part of the problem. So it really is going to take a courageous minority, as it always does in these kinds of situations, to lead people out of this wilderness and dangerous, this cliff edge. So what were you saying? There was I lost my train there, but when people are feeling so complacent, I think it's important to kind of think back to Solomon Asch's experiments in conformity, where
which you discuss in your book, very, very,
yes,
it's
I have a whole chapter.
Not something the average reader knows about, but it sort of speaks to the way we think and live.
Right. Well, we mimic the behavior of others. I mean, it was very hard, for example, during the height of COVID, to go into a store without a mask on if everybody else around you was wearing a mask. Even if, again, it wasn't a matter of principle, and even if it wasn't even required. It's just very hard to buck up against that, that impulse to conform and fit in. And so, but one of the really interesting things, so his experiment, there was nothing political about it. It just had to do with the length of the line and the subject. If everybody else was giving the wrong answer, when the obvious answer was line 3 and everybody else was saying line 2, a huge percentage of the time, the subject would go along, deny the evidence of his own eyes, and go along with the incorrect answer. Nothing controversial about the issue. So it's much worse when it's a controversial issue. But the bright side of that experiment is that when he did a variation where the subject was given just one partner, one person in the group gave the correct answer, then conformity dropped like a rock. And so this whole, it all depends on leadership and speaking the truth, and other people in the crowd who can see it, say, yeah, that's right, and follow through. And you've got that ripple effect or butterfly effect going. And that's really what we have to aim for.
Yeah. I think COVID obviously is the, it was the tipping point. It was sort of the experiment, which showed how easily we all become sheep. But to be fair to most people, they were scared. They were told to be scared by authority figures that they thought they should trust, who clearly did not know what they were doing. They didn't know the answers, yet pretended they did. And, the conformity impulse there is such that even people who might otherwise have been sort of independent thinkers were like, well, if it's a matter of saving the life of my family, well, I should do what they tell me. I can recall being in a supermarket and, we were all wearing masks, and one person demanded to be checked out not wearing a mask, and he was treated as if he was a terrorist. And now it's one thing to think that then, because, well, maybe the experts were right. Now, of course, there are still pockets of that. I mean, if you go to certain theaters and small spaces near where I live here outside of Philadelphia, they're still making people wear masks, even though studies have shown it's not going to do a darn thing to help anybody. Yet it becomes, part of it got bound up with politics. I think for some people, the mask, when it was bound up with Trump and, how to, I always wonder what would have the reaction to COVID been had Hillary Clinton been president. But nevertheless, the mask became the, sort of the red MAGA cap for Team Blue. And some people won't give it up. But in essence, it began with, a not, abnormal instinct of survival.
Oh, yes. No, I remember the very early days when you wondered, oh my goodness, this virus out of China. But, it really wasn't long before we found out that this virus was nearly 100% recoverable for people, especially for people who had no previous or, current comorbidities, no other serious health issues. It was definitely recoverable. So to me, in retrospect, it really does look like a huge experiment in social engineering and to enforce and test the levels of social conformity and social compliance. And it's really dangerous looking back on that. And of course,
because we failed the test, didn't we?
Well, yeah. Well, not only that, but the people that we would normally trust most, our own doctors, everybody wants it. You want to trust your doctor, of course. And but the whole medical establishment was being put under this pressure. Like, I think I've forgotten exactly when it was, but there was a threat to revoke the licenses of physicians who maybe prescribed ivermectin or maybe, did something that the ruling elite was, that would be counter to what the ruling elite wanted them to do. And so that would have a very, you go to medical school, you've got this big career. What are you going to, jeopardize your license? So putting doctors in that horrible position, and it has that trickle down effect on everybody else, of course. And so it was, and all the other institutions, of course, corporations and even the military, they were getting rid of anybody who wouldn't get the injection, and everything going so woke during the same era, that same period. You had just an explosion of the whole DEI, the BLM, Black Lives Matter, all these. Bow down. Even police officers were bowing down during these riots to the Black Lives Matter protesters. So it was a really chaotic era that gave the ruling elites a whole lot of grist for their mill. And so, I don't know, going forward, my hope is that those people who have, who are courageous and are willing to speak truth, are willing to say never again to this sort of stuff. And of course, that gets old for a lot of people. We go through this cycle, of complacency and compliance, and then, things get out of hand, and then we say never again, and then we go right back into that cycle. So it's something we really have to keep a check on. And I wrote the book so that we become more aware of where these instincts, not instincts, impulses, these negative impulses can lead. Now, having said that, and I do mention in the book that the conformity impulse can serve very well in a primitive, primitive setting where, survival is a big issue. But in a highly technological society like ours, you have to really keep a check on that conformity impulse.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing to me is that, most people really don't want to talk about COVID anymore. On any level, it's not, it's a bad dream. They hated it. But we haven't really resolved these issues. We haven't sort of had an accounting for, what went right, what went wrong, how we were misled. And it's not as if we need to have show trials about it, but until we do have an accounting, these debates go on. The people still walk. If you go into major cities, you still see people walking around outdoors wearing masks, still petrified. They don't want to give up, their addiction to the fear of COVID. And I'm not saying this, judgmentally, really, because all the authority sources and their affiliations that they do have tell them to fear it. They tell them to cling to it. and that those who pushed against it were bad people, and it got bound up with politics. That it was, if you were opposing lockdowns, you were a right-wing lunatic who should just live in the forest and not be around civilized people.
Right. Well, and I think that my thesis of the weaponization of loneliness really played into that because, I have another thesis in there I call the machinery of loneliness. And the main components of that machinery, and they've existed at least since the French Revolution and even before, but are identity politics, which seeks to divide us into demographic groups, not allow us to see one another as individuals that are unique. That's identity politics. And then political correctness, which induces us to self-censor and shut up about what we believe or even lie about what we believe. And then the third one is mob agitation and mob enforcement of identity politics, DEI, and political correctness. And those three kind of work in concert. There's a lot of other bells and whistles in the machinery of loneliness. But the common denominator of it all, and this is why, Jonathan, you talk about people who, go back, they want, they feel protected with their mask and everything. The common denominator is that fear of demonization, that fear of being called a bad name. I mean, there's a long list of names, last summer, Biden came out with semi-fascist, or fascist, or there's bigot, there's racist, there's white supremacists, there's conspiracy theorists, there's denier, like COVID denier, climate denier, election denier, transphobic, homophobic, all these names, all these are meant to drive fear of being cast into the outer darkness. And people cling to whatever they think is going to protect them from that, especially when people are kind of weak in terms of, even understanding what's going on with all of these phenomena. And, they cling to the mask, or they cling to, this idea that the unvaxxed, that's another one. What do they call it? Anti-vaxxer. That's another one of those.
And that it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated, even though whatever good the vaccines did, and as a sort of a prophylactic, as it seems to have made it easier for people who had it to recover from it, but it did not prevent anybody from. It didn't do what vaccines normally do, which is to provide immunity and prevent its spread. And yet, people who refused the mandates were, considered, like the typhoid Marys of the 21st century. That was, I think, obviously disproven, but yet we cling, sort of the government still seems to cling to that.
Well, and it's really unfortunate, because what's happened as a result of the lack of trust that people have had now because of, vaccine injuries, or, maybe it worked well for some people, but on the whole, as Trump warned, maybe, we don't want the cure to be worse than the disease. And so people who were really, they look at, like, I personally know someone who was paralyzed from the waist down after her first COVID shot. So everybody seems to know somebody who had, a bad reaction, and, she's permanently disabled now. And it's just tragic. And I know other cases, where people were separated from their loved ones. COVID had nothing to do with, COVID just because, you weren't supposed to go in the hospital, but even if they both tested negative for COVID, you weren't allowed to be with your loved one in their hour of greatest need. And this is, to me, brutal and, sadistic, really. And we put up with a lot of really unprecedented brutalities. And so, anyway, getting back to the point, the unvaxxed or the uninjected were easily demonized as murderers, and the unclean or diseased or, spreaders, super spreaders. I mean, really, you don't really want to go there in a healthy society. Never. But, and in most cases with vaccines in the past, there never was an issue if somebody had a religious problem or, and they were aiming for like 100% practically. So this was totally unprecedented in terms of the force and the pressures that were used in every institution across society. And that machinery of loneliness played into that, I believe, that fear of being cast out, being singled out as a super spreader, or, all of that stuff that never would have occurred to anybody 50 years ago, 20 years ago even.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, as you already noted, there certainly was a connection between sort of the lockdown of our society and, sort of the atomization of it, the forced isolation, and what happened in the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter riots and the sort of moral panic that swept through, our society about race, and the way it weaponized, sort of cancel culture, which we knew existed before then, but had never had such force, had never been, so weaponized against people, against society. And I think it's connected to sort of a cultural Marxist, war on Western civilization as a whole, in ways that I think nobody very few people, some writers did, but it really was made manifest because we were so isolated, so ready to buy into groupthink, so ready to behave as mobs.
Unfortunately, that's what happened, and people tend to kind of go along with the mobs. I have a chapter on the history of radical utopian revolutions that showed how easily these mobs form and how easily people who would never have considered certain ideas in their past, when everybody around them, or the propaganda, and it's one-sided propaganda with a media monopoly, pushes it, how easily people sign on to some of these really destructive agendas. And that's why my point that I've made many times is that when you look at all of the destructive agendas around us, whether you're looking culturally at what's going on with the transgender agenda with youth and the whole issue of surgeries and puberty block, or if you're looking at, the insane levels of debt that our country is going into, or the woke effect, what's going on in the military with all this wokeness and the whole drag queen thing. It goes on and on. There's a long, long list. And so the question is, how did it get to this point? And my answer is, the common thread is self-censorship. When we can't just say, hey, hold on a minute here. No, this doesn't make sense. And of course, when we're, pressured not to say those things, then that gives so much oxygen to these dangerous agendas. We do all the heavy lifting for tyrants when we censor ourselves, when we, are afraid to speak up, or even in many cases, people will just lie about what they believe to get that little pat on the back and to, feel accepted. And people are a whole lot more susceptible to that if they don't have strong relationship bonds that they can fall back on. If you don't have strong family, strong faith, strong friendships, community, and all of that, where you could say, I'll say whatever I want. I have my, I can let my hair down also with my family and all that. When you have that, that gives you all that inner strength that allows you to resist all of these, horrendous mandates and everything, and resist a totalitarian rule. Really, that's what Nisbet wrote about, is how our bonds of affection are really what allow us, and these strong bonds of faith are what allow us to resist. And he said, and the shrewd totalitarian mindset knows that. And that's why they're always trying to break down those sources of strength, the associations. Because when we're isolated and we don't even know what somebody else thinks and we can't exchange ideas, we're powerless, really. We can't verify reality with one another. And so that's my little point there about self-censorship, and how I believe political correctness, decades of it, are really what did all the heavy lifting and gave oxygen to so many of these dangerous agendas. And we have to learn to keep that in check. That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, well, I think that's undoubtedly true. And I think one of the, sort of one of the defenses that we have outside of those sort of, societal forces that usually militate against groupthink, as you say, religion, family, community, journalism, the ability of a free press to sort of strike back, to talk back to power. Journalism really failed. I mean, at least mainstream corporate journalism failed, certainly during the COVID crisis. Certainly there were independent voices, throughout it, where I write at JNS, and of course, where we both write at the Federalist, there are examples, there are others. But the newsrooms of mainstream corporate media, places like the New York Times, which historically, the strongholds of, against the government and of adversarial attitudes towards power, they became the mob, the groupthink mobs, enforcing it within their own newsrooms and promulgating, sort of the official propaganda, whether it's about DEI or COVID or whatever the agenda, of the, is, and portraying it as mainstream America and making it, and further isolating people who want to talk back.
Yeah, absolutely. And also shutting out any other voice, any other newspaper, any other, social media outlet that would allow those voices to get through. That's why there's so much of what they call the cancel culture, is to jam any other voice and then, of course, saturate the public with their own propaganda as a monopoly. And of course, through history, you see that the first thing that any totalitarian revolution does is take over the media, that's what the Bolsheviks took over, the presses, took over the telegraph office. I mean, the very first thing is to get the megaphones and to make sure nobody else that might not, comply has access to the microphone. So, and how did that happen? Well, I think, again, I think it's just kind of that natural human foible, that need to, not be ostracized and just to go along with the flow of whatever the propaganda says in order to be considered, part of the herd. And so that's how they're reacting. And it's tragic when you think about how much is lost in terms of the cross-pollination of ideas and, so much that true progress that could have been made in human relations if it weren't for that. But I guess this is kind of the default position of humanity. I mean, it goes, it's like the original sin, wanting to be God. They all want to, be some kind of voice of authority as though they're God. That's where a lot of these ruling elites are coming from, sadly.
Yes. And, just spoke of journalism, but of course the main weapon, is education and the schools. And I think, certainly many people were caught by surprise. I think it's axiomatic that a lot of Americans had no idea what was being taught in their schools until their kids were at home, on computer screens, and they got a chance to hear it. But as you speak of the long march through our institutions, education certainly is one where groupthink, the cultural Marxists, really infiltrated and have solidified their hold on it through the unions, through the bureaucracies. And certainly there has been some pushback against. We saw what happened in 2021 in Virginia, which helped influence the outcome of an election, pushing back against sort of race indoctrination and sexual ideology indoctrination. But where do we go? Even after that sort of setback for the establishment, they're still largely in control of things, and it's not clear that there are many more revolts going on. Although we would hope that example will spread.
Yeah, no, but a lot of state legislators are, passing laws to kind of, push back against that. However, they are getting their own pushback from these mobs that go into the state houses and so on. But it's education has always been the main focus, the prime focus of these left-wing radicals, because that's the instrument through which everybody gets credentialed into the other institutions. I mean, if you control education, you control who gets credentialed to be a lawyer, a judge, a doctor, a business CEO. I mean, you get into all of the universities. It started, of course, with the universities and K-12 education. And an interesting footnote to that is that Bill Ayers, the domestic terrorist of the 60s, 70s, spent the last more than 40 years focused on K-12 education out of Chicago and making sure that the schools of education graduated teachers who were inculcated with all of these, crazy, left-wing, queer theory and all the other, race theory and all of that was all a big part of the picture. And he, I believe, was, played a major role in doing that. And he understood that controlling the minds of the children is what leads to this, this chaos, what we would call chaos, but what they see as some kind of form of their, crazy revolution. Basically, it's all about playing God, is what it looks like totally to me.
Yeah, well, I think when you reference sort of things like the revolution in ideas about sex, gender, transgenderism, and the way that sort of took a hold of our institutions. Joe Biden calls it the civil rights issue of our time. Yet I think that may be the bridge too far for many Americans who might otherwise have been willing to go along with just about everything. I mean, we saw under COVID, the vast majority of us, if we're scared enough, if we're influenced enough, if we're afraid enough of not, about standing out, we'll go along. But that seems to be one issue where, people are saying, wait a minute, that's a bit too far. Now, it still has a powerful hold on, popular culture, the media, and even the government now. And yet, that's one thing where the pushback exists is, if you don't believe us, ask the people who own Anheuser-Busch.
Oh, yeah. No, we could go on and on about that, but I mean, I could anyway. But the thing that I would focus on with the whole issue of gender ideology is that is a way of really destabilizing not just the mind of the child, but, the entire society. I mean, when all of a sudden you're going to say that human beings are no longer a dimorphic species of male and female. No, it's all, we can't relate to one another except as what? Atomized, robots or something. This is a really destructive, I call it the mind rape of the children, to tell them that they are neither male nor female, or tell them things that make them hate their body or suggest that they should reject their bodies. It's so insanely cruel that I just, I just can't really, I would imagine that most parents who love their children cannot really wrap their heads around it. And yes, as you said, Jonathan, I think for so many people, this is a bridge too far. I think Matt Walsh has actually said that this is the hill he's willing to die on. I mean, to see what is being done, especially the pushing of these, puberty blockers and the surgeries and
so-called affirming care, which is actually mutilation and castration.
Exactly. Yeah, I wrote a piece almost 10 years ago about that, by the way, about the sex change regret and the mutilations and everything. And I think it was maybe 9 years ago, called Trouble in Transtopia. And I think we are beginning to see that more. And I think parents who love their children are really coming out and either trying to homeschool them. And of course, homeschooling is threatened, but by this mass state, but also fighting against it. Most people don't feel they have the bandwidth to go off to these school board meetings. It's much less run for school board to try to fight this stuff, but it needs to be done. Everything, begins on the local level. And we have to understand that that's really, it's like a war on our families, on our friendships, through this weaponization of loneliness, through this fear of being cast out and demonized if you don't get with these insane programs and agendas.
Yeah, I think this is really important, not just because, some of what is being promulgated seems insane. It is because, as you have put it, attacks on the family are, it's an attack on Western civilization. It's an attack on our ability to think and act independently apart from the mob. And, when the family is destroyed, now it's done and it's persuasive to a lot of people because it's done in the name of inclusion, of, don't be mean to people who are different. Well, people shouldn't be mean to people who are different. We shouldn't discriminate. People should be allowed to do whatever, live their lives the way they want to live. And yet, if society sort of normalizes the abnormal, if, sort of this debate that, among conservatives, I keep going back to it, that was held like 4 years ago between Sohrab Ahmari and David French about, drag queen story hours. And I think, many of us, I think many sort of conservatives, were sort of sympathetic initially to David French's stand, saying, let people do whatever they want. It doesn't bother you. But the bad does, as much as I disagree with Sohrab about a lot of things, the bad does drive out the good in society, and it becomes the norm. And it, we get to the point where it's not just an aberration; it's where attorney generals of states are saying we need a drag queen story hour in every school, and we're getting one.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no. Where it's ending up is like mass atomization. I mean, we think, we're being kind by, or inclusive and all of that, equity, so on. Equity really is a call for sameness, for leveling, for all of the things that make us unique, erasing them.
It's the opposite actually of equality and of equal opportunity. It's not a synonym.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of diversity. I mean, everybody's got to be leveled in the same and think the same and speak the same and act the same. And that's really, when you get down to it, what they're getting at with equity. It's kind of like a mechanized society that you read in a dystopian novel, like the novel We by Zemyatin. It's all mechanized. And it's almost like that's what they're going for. But when you think about the mediating institutions like family, faith, and community, but particularly family, that unit, and there are billions of them, right? And they've got, everybody has their own traditions, their own heritage, their own, I'm talking, of course, about the intact family, but, it really blossoms into building communities and that's kind of it's like the fount of civilization is through that unit. And it's also the place where we balance our responsibility to others with our sense of identity. It's where we learn our identity. You think about genealogy and if you're able to, kind of trace your roots and where did I come from and where am I going? And a child gets that strong sense of identity from the family, and they also get the sense of responsibility that they carry into the wider world. And that's why it's like the buffer zone between the isolated individual who's basically powerless and the mass state that would control all associations and even atomize us, isolate us in order to control us. And, I know that might sound over the top to, some folks, but having looked at this for as long as I have and contemplated it and seeing how things are playing out, I just can't reach any other conclusion. I don't think anybody else who would look at all of this stuff would either.
Yeah. Now, in the conclusion of your book, you do provide some hope. You don't leave us, just with like the world's coming to the end. I mean, you've alluded to it already, but talk a little bit about how you feel, where the recovery begins against these forces that are weaponizing, loneliness, that are isolating us, dividing us, and conquering us, as you say in your book. How do we start fighting back?
Right. Well, the very first thing, and I know it's hard, but to understand that pessimism is lethal. Demoralization, if you've heard, Yuri Bezmenov's, the former KGB, the defector, talk about the subversion of institutions in society. He says the first phase is demoralization. You have to demoralize the society before you can destabilize it and move on with the revolution. And so we have to really become aware that optimism is, we want to keep that alive. And that there are many different pathways for people, even as individuals, to help build a sense or rebuild civil society. For example, I keep coming back to that quote from the excellent book by Jacques Ellul called Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, where he says, propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins. And he means one-on-one. Our ability to influence another person, just to exchange ideas or just say, ooh, that public art looks bad. It looks pretty crass. And people will say, yeah, I thought about it. Just being able to express your ideas and opinions openly is what really forges these connections in society. So understand first that a single voice can make a huge difference, and every totalitarian knows that. So we need to understand it as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep trying to shut up every single voice. So that's number one. Number two, help build awareness. I have, and I'm getting ready, I'm embarking on a project on book clubs that deal just in this theme, just in the theme of the weaponization of loneliness. That, it's an idea to get people talking about these phenomena, these dynamics, and what we can do, become more aware of them. And also building parallel policies, parallel institutions. This is an asymmetric war now. I mean, if they have, they have control of all of the major institutions, we have to start building from the ground up. And we have to understand that this is not an overnight thing. It didn't happen overnight. It's not going to be repaired overnight, but we just keep forging ahead, and we don't give up hope. And there is a lot of hope. There's a lot of different things that we can do as individuals to build those parallel policies. It starts one-on-one. It just starts with real friendship and outreach. I mean, I think that those of us who have strong families, strong ties of faith, strong community, should be reaching out maybe to some who don't, who are able to understand how important it is, and then start building these connections. So anyway, in my conclusion, I call it a wrench in the machinery of loneliness. I go into more detail about all of that.
Right. My last question to you, as we're sort of winding down, and I'm going to go a little bit off topic. Your background, your academic background, and your career began as an analyst of the CIA about Russia, about the Soviet Union and its propaganda, which I think, obviously that set you on the path to your current field of study. But right now, that's, the former Soviet Union is much in the news, the war, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How would you analyze the way we have reacted to that, Russian propaganda, and indeed the other side pushing the other narrative about it? Where do you come down on, the current controversies of whether, the war in Ukraine is, as Mitch McConnell said, and I guess Joe Biden agrees, the most important thing in the world?
Well, okay, Jonathan. you've got me in a position where I do have opinion. I do have an opinion about it. It's a very general opinion. And, I don't get into the details of that conflict. Yes, my background is I have a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history. And then I had different, during my time at the CIA, I was an analyst. And one of my major focuses was on media analysis of the Soviet Union and, their propaganda. It's a totally different world today than it was during the Cold War. Totally, maybe not totally, no. But it's a different world. And it's different. The environment is different. How do I look at this conflict? I honestly, my gut tells me, and the way I see it, is that it's a kind of a manufactured, boy, I'm going out on a limb here, Jonathan, but I see it as kind of a way to push for this global Great Reset. That's how it looks to me. I don't necessarily, I know a lot of people, friends who, Putin, yeah, he's a nasty guy. But my view, my gut tells me that this is all part of pushing towards this, the goals of the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, and that I find a whole lot more dangerous than, a kind of a multipolar world.
Yeah. Well, I happen to agree with you. And I think it's kind of an odd thing because this is a war that, a lot of people on the right, certainly the establishment Republican Party, sees it as if the Cold War had never ended and as if the Warsaw Pact was still poised, to overrun all of Western Europe. And I think people on the left, because they have, because the Ukraine got mixed up in the effort to impeach Trump, it's like this is the war that, the first war in 70 years that the left has learned to love. So I think it's kind of become something different from what people say it is. But nevertheless, it is interesting to hear you give that point of view and sort of pushing back against the consensus. But I'd say that's, I think you're kind of onto something there. Stella, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to recommend your book to our audience. It's worth your time and an important contribution to discussion about our politics and society. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.